The Measure of a Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barb Gardner. The Measure of a Man by Randall Garrett. What is desirable is not always necessary, while that which is necessary may be most undesirable. Perhaps the measure of a man is the ability to tell one from the other, and act on it. Alfred Pendray pushed himself along the corridor of the battleship Shane, holding the flashlight in one hand, and using the other hand and his good leg to guide and propel himself by. The beam of the torch reflected queerly from the pastel-green walls of the corridor, giving him the uneasy sensation that he was swimming under water, instead of moving through the blasted hulk of a battleship 1,000 light-years from home. He came to the turn in the corridor and tried to move to the right, but his momentum was greater than he had thought, and he had to grab the corner of the wall to keep from going on by. That swung him around, and his sprained ankle slammed agonizingly against the other side of the passageway. Pendray clenched his teeth and kept going. But as he moved down the side passage, he went more slowly, so that the friction of his palm against the wall could be used as a brake. He wasn't used to maneuvering without gravity. He'd been taught it in cadets, of course, but that was years ago and parsecs away. When the pseudo-grav generators had gone out, he'd retched all over the place, but now his stomach was empty and the nausea had gone. He had automatically oriented himself in the corridors so that the doors of the various compartments were to his left and right, with the ceiling above and the deck below. Otherwise he might have lost his sense of direction completely in the complex maze of the interstellar battleship. Or, he corrected himself, what's left of a battleship. And what was left? Just Al Pendray and less than half of the once mighty Shane. The door to the lifeboat hold loomed ahead in the beam of the flashlight, and Pendray braked himself to a stop. He just looked at the dogged port for a few seconds. Let there be a boat in there, he thought. Just a boat, that's all I ask. And air, he added as an afterthought. Then his hand went out to the dog handle and turned. The door cracked easily. There was air on the other side. Pendray breathed a sigh of relief, braced his good foot against the wall, and pulled the door open. The little lifeboat was there, nestled tightly in her cradle. For the first time since the Shane had been hit, Pendray's face broke out into a broad smile. The fear that had been within him faded a little, and the darkness of the crippled ship seemed to be lessened. Then the beam of his torch caught the little red tag on the airlock of the lifeboat. "Repair underway. Do not remove this tag without proper authority." That explained why the lifeboat hadn't been used by the other crewmen. Pendray's mind was numb as he opened the airlock of the small craft. He didn't even attempt to think. All he wanted to see was exactly how the vessel had been disabled by the repair crew. He went inside. The lights were working in the lifeboat. That showed that its power was still functioning. He glanced over the instrument and control panels. No red tags on them, at least. Just to make sure, he opened them up, one by one, and looked inside. Nothing wrong, apparently. He went through the door in the tiny cabin that led to the engine compartment, and he saw what the trouble was. The shielding had been removed from the atomic motors. He just hung there in the air, not moving. His lean, dark face remained expressionless, but tears welled up in his eyes and spilled over, spreading their dampness over his lids. The motors would run all right. The ship would take him to Earth. But the radiation leakage from those motors would kill him long before he made it home. It would take 10 days to make it back to base, and 24 hours of exposure to the deadly radiation from those engines would be enough to ensure his death from radiation sickness. His eyes were blurring from the film of tears that covered them. Without gravity to move the liquid, it just pooled there, distorting his vision. He blinked the tears away, then wiped his face with his free hand. Now what? He was the only man left alive on the Shane, and none of the lifeboats had escaped. The rat cruisers had seen to that. They weren't really rats, those people, not literally. They looked humanoid enough to enable plastic surgeons to disguise a human being as one of them, although it meant sacrificing the little fingers and little toes to imitate the four-digited rats. The rats were at a disadvantage there. They couldn't add any fingers, but the rats had other advantages. They bred and fought like rats. Not that human beings couldn't equal them or even surpass them in ferocity, if necessary. But the rats had nearly 1,000 years of progress over Earth. Their industrial revolution had occurred while the Anglos and the Saxons and the Jutes were pushing the Britons into Wales. They had put their first artificial satellites into orbit while King Alfred the Great was fighting off the Danes. They hadn't developed as rapidly as man had. It took them roughly twice as long to go from one step to the next, so that their actual superiority was only a matter of 500 years, and man was catching up rapidly. Unfortunately, man hadn't caught up yet. The first meeting of the two races had taken place in interstellar space and had seemed friendly enough. Two ships had come within detector distance of each other and had circled warily. It was almost a perfect example of the Leinster hypotheses. Neither knew where the other's home world was located, and neither could go back home for fear that the other would be able to follow. But the Leinster hypotheses couldn't be followed to the end. Leinster's solution had been to have the parties trade ships and go home, but that only works when the two civilizations are fairly close in technological development. The rats certainly weren't going to trade their ship for the inferior craft of the Earthmen. The rats, conscious of their superiority, had a simpler solution. They were certain, after a while, that Earth posed no threat to them, so they invited the Earthship to follow them home. The Earthmen had been taken on a carefully conducted tour of the rats' home planet, and the captain of the Earthship, who had gone down in history as Sucker Johnson, was convinced that the rats meant no harm, and agreed to lead a rat ship back to Earth. If the rats had struck then, there would never have been a rat-human war. It would have been over before it started. But the rats were too proud of their superiority. Earth was too far away to bother them for the moment. It wasn't in their line of conquest just yet. In another 50 years, the planet would be ready for picking off. Earth had no idea that the rats were so widespread. They had taken and colonized over 30 planets, completely destroying the indigenous intelligent races that had existed on 5 of them. It wasn't just pride that had made the rats decide to wait before hitting Earth. There was a certain amount of prudence, too. None of the other races they had met had developed space travel. The Earthmen might be a little tougher to beat. Not that there was any doubt of the outcome as far as they were concerned, but why take chances? But while the rats had fooled Sucker Johnson and some of his officers, the majority of the crew knew better. Rat crewmen were little short of slaves, and the rats made the mistake of assuming that the Earth crewmen were the same. They hadn't tried to impress the crewmen as they had the officers. When the interrogation officers on Earth questioned the crew of the Earth ship, they too became suspicious. Johnson's optimistic attitude just didn't jibe with the facts. So, while the rat officers were having the red carpet rolled out for them, Earth intelligence went to work. Several presumably awe-stricken men were allowed to take a conducted tour of the rat ship. After all, why not? The 20th century Russians probably wouldn't have minded showing their rocket plants to an American of Captain John Smith's time, either. But there's a difference. Earth's government knew Earth was being threatened, and they knew they had to get as many facts as they could. They were also aware of the fact that if you know a thing can be done, then you will eventually find a way to do it. During the next 50 years, Earth learned more than it had during the previous 100. The race expanded, secretly moving out to other planets in that sector of the galaxy, and they worked to catch up with the rats. They didn't make it, of course. When, after 50 years of presumably peaceful, but highly limited, contact, the rats hit Earth, they found out one thing: that the mass and energy of a planet armed with the proper weapons cannot be outclassed by any conceivable concentration of spaceships. Throwing rocks at an army armed with machine guns may seem futile, but if you hit them with an avalanche, they'll go under. The rats lost